Dr. Marks, thanks so much for having this conversation with us. And right now there are so many discussions happening about race and bias, good, bad, and uncomfortable. So why is it that we need to have these conversations right now in the space?
Well, I think as a country, even just if you look at the last year, there's been a lot going on. So the virus has had differential impact in terms of cases and hospitalizations and deaths by race and ethnicity. We've had civil unrest related to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. We had a divisive political season. So a lot's going on. And I think that questions are arising in ways and at levels they haven't in the past. So, for example, after the George Floyd situation, many of our partners, corporate Fortune 500s, as well as nonprofits and so forth, were reaching out like, look, we want to take a stance on social justice. We want to have conversations internally amongst our employees around these topics. And so we were partnering with them as they drafted memos to send out. And it seems like organizations are talking about racism, sexism, social justice at a level that I haven't seen, at least in the past 25 years that I've been doing this work, which is good. But these conversations, when they become deep, can become uncomfortable. And so guiding our partners on how to have these conversations without it being threatening, without folks becoming defensive, based upon, we want it to be based upon empathy and humanity, not guilt, shame, and blame. So we think we're at a time where we can have these conversations in an effective manner. But our country needs some healing, given everything that's going on recently.
And can people really change? I mean, are there situations where people have implicit bias that maybe most people haven't necessarily thought about or considered?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing about implicit bias, it's sort of a byproduct of our natural brain functioning, right? So as you live your life, you take in the world, some things you take in repeatedly. So if I said to you, police officer, and you think male, well, about 88 to 90% of police officers in the US are men. You're not sexist, but you associate police with men due to repeated exposure. If I say nurse, you may think female. A significant or majority of nurses are female. So there's certain things you're overexposed to just as you live your life, and your mind is going to lock in those associations. You will not know when it happens. But when it does, the seed for implicit bias is planted. It may blossom, it may not, but it's there. And it sort of applies to everyone. Also, we all belong to groups: family, race, gender, your neighborhood, your alma mater. We all belong to groups. And it's typical for human beings to treat their in-group members slightly or much better than out-group members. It's normal, we all do that. For example, if you take your loved one to the airport at 4 o'clock in the morning, then I do that for a stranger off the street, right? Technically, that's a differential treatment of another human being based upon the group to which they belong. It's a form of bias, it's different. But we understand, okay? That person could be a serial killer, axe murderer. But if you were to hire your loved one at work, when there's 10 other people more qualified, you do that again and again and again, that's a problem, okay? So favor your in-group, normal, we all do it, but it becomes a problem when your in-group favoritism begins to systematically disadvantage an out-group.
Is there a story you can share about how your talks, and you've given so many, but how they have made a difference or a change in someone's life?
Yeah, so we had a lot of, when we conduct evaluations afterwards, and we get positive feedback, generally speaking, but we'll get these emails pretty frequently where people say, you know, and remember, we also train a lot of police officers, trained over 32,000 police officers in the last few years. So sometimes a police officer will reach out, which is almost unheard of following a training, but they'll say, hey, you know, I was a bit skeptical in your training, but I was on the street the other day and, you know, it was a situation where something happened and something you said in your training clicked and it helped me in that situation. So those sorts of things we love to hear. I mean, it's anecdotal, but we love to hear it. We've gotten somewhere, there was a white woman in the Midwest, I won't say what organization we trained, but she emailed afterwards, it's like, this changed my perspective. Like, I hadn't thought about things that you raised. I hadn't thought about race and racism in the history of the US, the way you talked about it. I hadn't thought about the privilege that I may have. So she was very effusive and expressive in describing how it impacted her. Said that she had begun having conversations with her family, with her friends and her coworkers about the content that was shared, and that she wants to be involved in making the world better in some social justice movement in a concrete way. So that sort of thing can happen. But we still, as a scientist, we do want to see organizations change to the point where outcomes, the needle's being moved in a significant way. We haven't seen that with the patterns or the frequency that we like just yet, but there are some promising practices out there that we feel pretty good about.
And I know that you've been here to Colorado many times to talk to groups about bias and implicit bias in education and law enforcement, as you mentioned, with police officers. A lot of the tensions we've seen in the past year here in Denver and across the country have involved clashes with police, involving people and police officers with bias. So what conversations in these areas do you think we need to be having?
Well, the conversation is the key. What we find in doing this, we National Training Institute of Race and Equity at Morehouse College. So what we do and what we find with our police work and community work is a lack of communication. Community members aren't talking to police and vice versa in a space where they're open. They come to the table saying, look, I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to understand your perspective. I'm going to express mine too, but I want to understand your perspective. To me, in doing this work, that is the most significant challenge, a lack of communication. Without communication, you can have understanding. By talking to police, I've come to understand them. Once I can understand them, I can empathize with them. We can't even get to the point of understand, like, for example, the continuum of force. That's sort of a difficult thing for many people to understand. I was doing a training, I won't say where, I was in a training facility for a large urban police department. It was in the West Coast. And in a training facility, they're learning these hand and body, holds and moves and that sort of thing. And it looks rough when police have to take somebody down physically. It looks rough, like slamming them and grabbing them and all that. It looks pretty bad, especially if it's on the street and you see this YouTube video and all that. And I was like, wait, you all are pretty rough. And it's like, well, the better we are at hands and body, the less likely we are to escalate up the continuum of force. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, if I can handle a situation with my hands in my body, I don't have to use pepper spray. I don't have to use a weapon. I never thought about it like that. Right. And they would say, my ability to do this well could save somebody's life. Okay, that's really tricky because sometimes visually it looks excessive. It looks horrible. It looks aggressive. I understand, right? But if the psychology is, if I can subdue them like this, I don't have to pull out my gun. I never understood it that way until I had a conversation with police, right? So once I understood, I could sort of empathize and say, wow, that could be a tough choice. You don't want to be excessive physically, but also, you don't want to have to go up the continuum unnecessarily. So that level of empathy came through understanding and communication. So if community leaders, and they don't have to be just, the big pastors and preachers, it could be folks who have influence, but if folks from the community come to the table with an open mind, folks in policing come to the table with an open mind and don't dismiss the community out of hand. They don't know what it's like. They don't understand us. Both come with an open mind, that can work. Yeah. Okay. But it can be tough. It can be tough.
Definitely. I know you're a father, so how do you take all of these conversations and apply those to our children? What do you teach your children? How do we teach our own children?
Yeah, so a lot of times we work with parent groups and even K through 12 public schools, not public schools, just educators. And they'll say, well, how do we de-bias our kids? How do we make sure they're not biased? Well, we sort of split it up into two categories. If your kid's on the younger end, maybe 9, 10 years or younger, we lean towards balance of exposure, right? What they're reading, what they're watching, the TV shows, the movies. Show them a diversity of characters playing the leading roles, right? So the prince or the princess or the hero can look black, white, Hispanic, Asian, whatever, as well as the villain, right? But have a balance. And we live in a time now where we have so many options in terms of media to consume. So, bunch of cable channels, on demand, Netflix, YouTube, Hulu. We can watch what we want, when we want. So be intentional about saying, okay, we want to sort of show them these images in a balanced way. Same thing with books, same things with other type of media for the younger kids. Now, once they become into like middle school, a little older, and they can understand the history of different groups in this country and what that can mean, and you can start to talk to them in a more nuanced or complex manner. What you want to do is expose them to the achievements of many different groups. You say, yes, in the US, not all groups have been treated the same, but many of these groups have made positive contributions. So there's good in every group, right? And highlight that in a way that's deeper than the surface. Martin Luther King, Black History Month on the surface. You want to go deeper than that, okay? Because many different races and ethnicities have contributed to advancing American society. We need to have a deeper understanding of that. So younger ages, balance of exposure, older ages, deeper education, and really pushing our young people to say, well, why do you choose, if you're in middle school or high school, who's in your group? And what was the basis for inclusion or exclusion? Is it because they were smart, or they played a sport, or they have a certain socioeconomic status? Because cliques, those groups start around that middle school age, And they know how to form in-groups and out-groups. They do it anyway. But it's interesting to talk to them about the basis of inclusion and exclusion. You'll start to hear some of their biases coming out.
I know a lot of what you teach people is part of a 60-minute special that will air right here on Denver 7. What will you be sharing with those who watch, and what do you want those takeaways to be?
Well, I'm going to take them through a journey. What is implicit bias? How does it impact us? What does it look like in the real world? What are some promising practices for addressing them? So we'll go through that process. You got to tune in to see. But some of the key takeaways, these are universal human principles that apply to all of us. As long as human beings exist, they will have both implicit and explicit bias, not going away. Okay, but there are things that you can do in the best interest of your personal development and your organizations to try to reduce the likelihood of your biases playing out systemically. So we'll talk about that. We will talk about sort of some aspects of U.S. society currently and historically that have been challenging, right? So I'm going to push, we're going to provoke some thought. But it's out of love and out of inclusion. You know, we're not guilt, shame, and blame and heavy-handed in that sort of sense. We work through empathy and our humanity. So you will be challenged, but I think you will learn something, and it should provoke some thought and conversation amongst your friends and family and your coworkers.
Because you have said that bias is just part of nature. So what can parents, teachers, other adults do to open our eyes, to maybe realize that we need to be having these conversations?
Yeah, I think just a willingness to acknowledge in our society, different groups exist, and there are different traits associated with those different groups. If you just acknowledge that, then if you have different input, you're going to have different output. So if the histories of different people in this country vary, and some folks were indigenous and their land was taken from them, some folks were brought here as slaves, some folks came here as refugees, some folks came here voluntarily, right? So we're here, but we came here under different circumstances and had different paths. Our willingness to own that and acknowledge with those different paths, they're going to be different outcomes, okay? And then we can have a real and authentic conversation. But if we're in denial, oh no, we're all American, you know, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that sounds romantic, that sounds nice, but from a practical perspective, that's not realistic. And so the tough conversation is to acknowledge everybody is not the same in terms of how they came here and how they perceive over time. Let's own that. Let's own the fact that they're perceived differently. So now moving forward, what can we do to address those differences in a way that's inclusive and equitable going forward? So those are the sorts of things we want folks to think about and take away.
And if there, final question here, if someone watches and leaves with one new idea, just one new idea or thought on bias, what should it be?
One new idea. I don't want to give this one away. I mean, there's going to be a few aha moments. And I think one is understanding how prevalent it is. Folks, the implicit bias, this stuff is in the air, and we're all inhaling. So if they can take that away, they'll be better for it. You got to tune in to see the rest.
We're looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Dr. Marks. Appreciate it.
Not a problem. Thank you.
Thank you.